gozaimasu. Good day, one and all, and welcome to today's Naruse a Day review. How many of you bought that? No, unfortunately, Naruse never made a Yakuza film. He was, however, the mentor to the director whose 1969 film Yakuza Law I am reviewing today. I'm taking a little bit of a break from Naruse as I've been looking at and writing about some other films and filmmakers, and I wanted to get these on paper and on video. I will be returning to my Mikio-thon, but I have been looking at some Ishii Teruo films. As I said, a former protege of Naruse. He was his assistant director on 3 or 4 films in the early 1950s, including some of his most successful films, like Mother, before he began a very different career in terms of the body of work that he ultimately produced later on in the 50s. I will perhaps do a longer video on Ishii Teruo. I think he has been well covered as the sort of J-sploitation king, Japan exploitation, for the various extreme cult films that he began to make as the 1960s wore on. A lot of these, like today's film, were portmanteau films like Love and Crime, or The Shogun's Joys of Torture, alongside other such delectable titles as Horrors of Malformed Men and Blind Beast versus Killer Dwarf. Yakuza Law, today's film, the film I'm just offering a brief review of, is also a portmanteau film comprising 3 distinct stories. Ishii began in this mode in the late 60s and made several films. Within the space of 2 years, he produced something like 10 or 11 films. And a lot of these are portmanteau narratives in which 3 or 4 different stories, largely unrelated, though in some instances connected by framing devices and recurrent characters, that are notable for their extreme material, their emphasis on sex and violence, and in some cases their preeminent sort of what came to be a paradigmatic focus on what is known in Japanese as eroguro nansensu, erotic grotesque nonsense. I think Yakuza Law is not in the latter category. There are moments of eroticism. There's moments that, if you are of a squeamish nature, will be inexorably grotesque. The credits of the film unfold over a montage of all kinds of tortures, decapitations, any and all manner of violence inflicted on the human body. And indeed, each of the 3 different stories that comprise the film have their own different sort of anchors in different types of sort of ritual punishment. Now, the notion of ritual or routine punishment for transgression will be very familiar to you if you are any kind of fan however cursory, of Yakuza cinema, or indeed of the samurai film genre, particularly the Chambara subset thereof, both of which are built around ritual physical punishment. In the case of samurai films, obviously seppuku or harakiri, ritual disembowelment. In Yakuza films, this is echoed, in some senses replaced, by the cutting off of a finger to atone for transgressions, indeed to atone for transgressions of a gang or Yakuza code. And it's this Yakuza code or Yakuza law that Ishii takes as a point of departure here. So he's kind of offering something of a sort of meta cinematic foray into the Yakuza film, where he looks at notions of transgression, punishment, and violence inflicted for perceived wrongdoings within the insular, sort of hermetically sealed environment of Yakuza gangs. The cutting off of a finger looks in this film like the most sort of pleasant and simple thing that one could undertake or have inflicted upon oneself. This is a film in which characters have ears lopped off, eyes gouged out, in which they are summarily burned over all parts of their body, where tongues are cut out, where all kinds of different ways of being shot, stabbed, sliced, crushed, you name it, pretty much it's somewhere in this film. And as I said, this is kind of a point of departure. I think the film is called Yakuza Law, but it could be Yakuza Law, L-O-R-E instead of L-A-W. Such is the nature of Ishii's sort of engagement, critical engagement with what people understand about this genre. As I said, it opens with a montage of different punishments, and this feeds into three separate films, three separate short films that, in a sense, detail the cinematic sort of development of the Yakuza genre. So we have, to all intents and purposes, a samurai film in the first story. We have, in the second, a film set a little bit later, but still period. A film that's set, I think, during the Meiji Restoration, when the Yakuza as a real life sort of outfit or concern began to develop. This is around the sort of late 19th century. And we have a contemporary story set in 1960s Tokyo, which in some ways looks forward. This was made in 1969, this film. In some ways, we have the so-called Ninkyo Eiga, the heroic chivalry mode of Yakuza filmmaking that had predominated in the 60s in films like Life as Theatre or the Abashiri prison films that Ishii directed. We have two sort of iterations of the Ninkyo Eiga, and then we have a film that in some ways looks forward to the so-called Jitsuroku Eiga, the true account or the true life story Yakuza film that would in the early 1970s be pioneered most notably by Fukusaku Kinji in his Battles Without Honor and Humanity series. So we have very definite heroes in the first two films, and we have at best an anti-hero in the last story. So in other words, what we see developing here is a progression from a firmly held belief in morality, in right and wrong. The virtuous samurai protagonist of the first film stands up for those who have, for various reasons, been singled out and victimized by the gang that he belongs to. In the second film, we have a good criminal character. Again, someone who has a code. They may be a criminal, and we have the paradigmatic, very common narrative trope of just being released from prison back into the landscape of a gang war or turf war. This is someone who, although not quite as separable from those around him as the earlier protagonist, nonetheless is someone who does live by a personal code, and someone whose actions stand between innocent victims and more or less evil perpetrators of violence. This is the sort of classic Ninkyo style, the chivalrous style, where the characters are discussed as anti-heroes in a lot of reviews and books, but they really are only by dint of being part of a criminal fraternity. Their actions are almost never seen to have any obvious or overt immoral ramifications or consequences. And in the final film, as I said, we look forward to the Jitsuroku, the true account, contemporary set phase of the Yakuza film that was still a few years away, where we have basically a free-for-all where nascent and naked greed and corruption in wider circles, in business practices, in corporate life, perhaps as part of the new face of a democratic, westernized, economically driven Japan, a free market capitalist Japan, where the Yakuza perhaps stands as a kind of metaphor. The notion of turf wars and of nefarious sort of practices, violence, has these sort of wider, perhaps metaphorical connotations. And indeed, as was the case in quote unquote real life in Japan, the Yakuza were increasingly being sort of annexed to business people, to corporate interests. They were being hired, they were being used in all kinds of underhand and nefarious ways by what I will again put in inverted commas as civilized or law-abiding society. And this is what we see in the last film. Ishii's style here has no real truck with the chaotic, handheld, frenetic style that Fukusaku would implement in his work, but it does feature this sort of cesspit of immorality in which morality itself is a very relative concept, and in which it's rather difficult to find any hero or even anti-hero with whom to fully empathize. Except that one of the things that sets apart this final story is that it is actually more of a piece with older Nikatsu films, where you would have a strong sort of international flavour, and you would have almost superhuman abilities. One of the key sort of factors, I think, that feeds into one of the key cinematic factors and specificities that feeds into this last story is nothing so much as James Bond. I think you have a whole slew of beautiful young nubile girls. You have very stylized action, particularly gunplay, and you have a sense of conducting business that touches on, if in no way delves into, sort of spycraft, if you like, or espionage. But really, the sort of cartoon-like focus on extraordinary action here suggests nothing so much, to me at least, as James Bond. So overall, this is a very eclectic film. As I said, it's not for the faint heart. It is the Japanese title relates to this notion of punishment, sort of extra legal punishment, if you like, you know, being punished by and within the bounds and codes of gang life. It can roughly be translated as a sort of history of Yakuza punishment. So this is the sort of point of departure for Ishii. And I think, although Ishii, who always saw himself as a mere artisan and who was sort of self-identified as a mere entertainer, he said that film has no truck with reality, and he sort of poo-pooed any sense that any of his films, or indeed that cinema in general, should explore any serious themes. But nonetheless, I think what we see here is a sense of what violence means in different historical contexts and in different cinematic contexts, and how we relate to that. And this is why it has this very interesting sort of meta-cinematic or meta-Yakuza charge, if you like. I think we, as well as getting this sort of blueprint for how the genre developed, we also get a sense of a canvas upon which Ishii can paint a series of scenes and actions and attitudes that throw a light back on the audience, or cast a mirror on the audience, in which we can examine our own sort of relationship to Yakuza films and the sort of violence endemic within the genre. So it becomes kind of about us as audience members, how much of the action we find heroic, enjoyable, how many of the characters we find relatable or empathetic, and how much wider significance we see in what is depicted. So, as I said, not for the faint heart. If you are an Ishii fan, you probably will have seen it already. But if you've seen some of his other sort of extreme films from this period in his career, especially if you've seen the joys of torture, or the history of the Shogun's harem and other such period films, and you enjoyed them, then this is a very sort of obvious companion piece, and one that I definitely would recommend. So give it a look. Let me know what you think. Comment down below. Like and subscribe, or don't. And I will speak to you next time.